Well, basically, how this works is these are pretty informal. Like as you can see, I mean, we're in my we usually don't have a whole lot of people show up in the room proper, but I record them and upload them to YouTube. But if we do get people show up and they ask questions in chat, I'll just pass those along to you.
Cool.
Yeah, but other than that, it's pretty laid back and pretty chill. I just kind of wanted to give you guys a chance to talk about the awesome stuff you're doing at SUU and kind of get some different perspectives. So
Great.
So I might we'll give it another minute and then I'll ask you a question. But generally, how are you doing?
Yeah, I mean, all things considered, doing pretty well.
Good. Glad to hear it.
Yeah. How about yourself?
Doing pretty good. Like I said, just kind of, like everybody else, I'm sure. So why don't we start by just having you kind of introduce yourself for people who might not know who you are and tell us a little bit about what you teach at SUU and why you chose that field.
Okay, yeah, sure. So I'm Kris Phillips, newly associate professor of philosophy, recently tenured. So I've been teaching at SUU since 2014. And I teach philosophy, and we have a pretty small program. So I end up teaching quite a few different things. Everything from intro to logic through senior seminar, theory of knowledge, mind, language, and reality, history of modern philosophy, which is 17th and 18th century European. So kind of the scientific revolution and all of the associated events going on there, the Enlightenment and whatnot. I came to SUU after spending a year teaching at Northern Michigan University as I was finishing my doctorate at the University of Iowa. I specialize in early modern, so 17th, 18th century European. That's kind of what brought me out here. They were looking for somebody who could teach a bunch of different classes, and somebody who is trained as a historian of philosophy. Let's see. I think you also asked, how did I end up in philosophy?
Yeah.
Okay. So growing up, I kind of grew up on a college campus. My dad was an English professor for 42 years, and he just retired 2 years ago now. So, growing up, I think I was always kind of exposed to philosophy through literature, but didn't really realize it until I got to college. And I bounced around. I think I changed my major 7 times as an undergrad, something like that.
Great.
Transferred schools, and just ended up falling into philosophy because my dad encouraged me to take a logic class. And it was just, I don't know what it was about it, but it immediately, I was hooked when I took that class. And I wanted to do more of that forever. And so here we are, some 20 some years later, still at it.
Yeah, no, good for you. One of the reasons I ask is because I feel like there's this kind of generalized misconception about like what philosophy is, and also I guess its usefulness in the modern world. And this is also coming from my own background as an English undergrad, where I got similar, resistance to that for the same reason. So maybe if you could tell us what you mean when you use the word philosophy, one, and then two, like what do you see as its use in the here and now?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And one of the things that's, I think, sometimes frustrating to people who are new to philosophy is that philosophers disagree about everything, including what philosophy is as a discipline. So the way I typically address that when people say like, okay, wait, you're a philosophy professor, what does that mean? What is philosophy? Um, is I'll try to characterize it by way of questions, the kinds of questions that we investigate. And in a lot of ways, I think that people, it's going to sound as if we kind of do a little bit of everything, and there's a very good reason for that. But the short version is this. The kinds of questions that we ask are fundamental questions, the answers to which are assumed by most of the other specialized disciplines in a university. Um, so, there's all kinds of pop culture stuff that brings up philosophical issues. So when we ask questions about the reliability of perceptual experience or something like this, movies like Inception or The Matrix or any sort of hallucinogenic kind of discussion or sort of dream state type stuff, we try to investigate how we could tell whether the things that seem real are in fact real. Now, of course, you might say, well, I mean, shouldn't we just leave it to the physicists or something? But insofar as physicists or biologists or any of the natural scientists engage these sorts of questions, they just kind of assume that what they're perceiving is real because there's really no other option, right? It's an empirical science. It's based on observation. And so we're asking a slightly different question about those sorts of things, not what are the observations, but rather, how do we know when observations are accurate? How do we know when we're doing things appropriately? So it's a slightly more fundamental question. And of course, that's not the only question. It's just one example. Um, there's a lot of talk sort of about justice today. I mean, especially given current events,
Right.
right? The proper scope and understanding of government, what the role of government is, what the nature of freedom is, this kind of thing. And I think a lot of people just kind of, again, assume that we have some sort of intuitive understanding of what that is. But philosophy is really sort of the practice of bringing to bear really careful, in-depth, detailed thought about these really fundamental questions. So we have famous quotes from the founding fathers about what sorts of truths are self-evident, about the nature of liberty, and so forth. And one of the things that I think is really important about philosophy is that they got a lot of those discussions from these Enlightenment thinkers that were writing in the 17th and 18th century. Jefferson, a lot of what he was writing about was awfully similar, I'll say, to what John Locke was writing about, at the turn of the 18th century. And so that's kind of what philosophy is and does. I mean, it's a massive oversimplification, but that's what I mean when I say it. So what's the use for today? Well, I mean, I think the uses are, in some sense, limitless. We always need to be asking, I think, fundamental questions about the nature of human rights. We need to be re-examining assumptions that we're making about the best way to interact with the world, weighing evidence. How do we know when testimony is reliable? How do we know about the fundamental nature of the world around us? What are the different sorts of assumptions that are working when we use even just basic terms? What do we even mean by those things? What do we mean when we say justice? What do we mean when we say freedom? What does it mean to say that someone has a right to something? What are the nature of rights? Are there human rights independent of legal rights? What is the origin of those things? And often with these kinds of questions, You can't just go run the numbers and figure it out. We need to really engage in this sort of critical, very abstract reflection to come to answers. Of course, we typically don't get concrete answers, but that's also something that's I think really important for people to become more comfortable with.
Yeah, I mean, you brought up a few really good points there, and I like that you tied in because I feel like a lot of times people will come to the idea of philosophy with the sense that it is abstract to the point that it really has no bearing on their life or how you mentioned how we interact with the world, right? So maybe they're not seeing that interaction. So I like that you brought in the fact that yeah, it has an immediate bearing on how we think politically, socially, kind of about these issues. Um, but I also really like what you said there at the end, how we have to be comfortable with knowing that we can't know the answers to things. Um, and I think that's a really good point. So maybe if you wouldn't mind kind of expanding on that a little bit, and also maybe um, because I think that idea is important, especially when we talk about living in an age of quote unquote fake news, and how do we truth becomes like so subjective to the point where right that it becomes super partisan. So
Mm-hmm.
mind kind of like addressing that.
Yeah, so it seems like there are a couple of things in there. So one thing that I think I would want to be a little bit cautious about is that I don't think that truth itself is subjective. I do think that there's a world that exists independent of anybody's perceptions, but I think that one of the things that's really difficult is getting past our own perceptions, our own experiences, our own implicit biases, all of the kind of theoretical machinery that goes into how we interpret what's going on in the world, puts up all of these barriers to getting to the truth. And I think that, I mean, I think you're right that there's this sort of idea that uh, there are certain things that are true for some people but not true for others. And I think this is another thing that philosophy can be really helpful with, is that we're often not very cautious in how we talk about things. And if we're not careful in how we talk about them, it can lead to not just misunderstanding, say, between you and me, but also to general broad scale conceptual confusion, which just muddies things even worse. And so one of the things that I want to say is that, so there might be things that are true about me or about my experiences, or they might be the way that I've interpreted particular things. But I think, without getting into too much kind of technical machinery and philosophy, there's still a fact, there's still a way that the world is, such that that's an accurate description of how I experience those events, or how I am at a particular time, or something like that. And so there's a sense in which it's still objective. Now, of course, getting to all of that is the really, really hard part, getting to what the world is like independent of anybody's experiences or whatever else. But I think this is why dialogue is so critical, not just in philosophy, though I do think that philosophy is intrinsically dialogical in nature, but in all sort of areas. Because every one of us has, as I sort of described it earlier, all of these layers between us and the world. And the only way we're going to kind of get to the way things really are is through a continuous sort of checking with other people, and almost like a triangulation, but not just with three, but with, everyone, right? So bring everything to the table, and let's see if we can construct a coherent picture of what we think things are probably like. And in that way, it's really no different from sort of replicability in scientific experimentation. from trying to get confirming evidence as much as possible, right? And it's important to note that it's confirming, it's never proving when we're talking about empirical things like this. I think most of our science students out there have been pretty well trained not to say that scientists have proven much of anything. And we try to avoid using proof, even in philosophy, unless we're doing deductive logic, in which case we got proofs all day long.
Great. Yeah. So I'm actually really glad that you brought up the kind of relationship there, especially to what you do with what we tend to think of as kind of like empirical science, right? Because and correct me if I'm wrong, but the era where your specialty is, that's kind of like the breaking off point, right? Where we start to see more of a separation between like science and philosophy as kind of distinct. There.
So, so I think that it's tempting to look at it that way,
Mhm.
um, in part because what we get um, right around the early 1600s, in the beginning of the 17th century with Galileo and Francis Bacon, you know, we get something that's recognizable as the scientific method. Um, but it's not clear that there was really any sort of sharp separation between what we would now call metaphysics or ontology, the study of being, what exists, and physics. Um, you know, natural philosophy was the term that, well, I guess intellectuals in Europe used for uh, what we would now call science at the time. So, you know, Newton's Principia was the mathematical principles of natural philosophy. And some of the more bizarre things that Newton himself thought become slightly less bizarre when you sort of couch it in the metaphysical framework that he was engaged in. So he's often made fun of for being an alchemist. Um, Now, of course, it's fairly unfair to make fun of him for being an alchemist at a time where there was no such thing as chemistry. Um, but it's also not totally insane to think that you could turn lead into gold if you presume that literally the totality of the universe is made out of one fundamental particle. If everything is literally the same, then it's just an organizational problem, right? And all of a sudden, alchemy doesn't sound so crazy. Um, and so you see this a lot, I think, in the 17th and 18th century, especially, is you get recognizable science or empirical science or what we think of as physics or astronomy, the development of chemistry into the 18th and 19th century. Um, but it's really not divorced in the way we think of it today from philosophy. It's all kind of rolled together. Mathematics, um, physics, astronomy, medicine, all of it is just kind of crammed together with fundamental philosophical questions about the nature of people, about the nature of government, about interactions, about matter, about questions about God, whether there is a God, if there is, what God's nature is like, does God interact with the material world? If so, how does that interaction work? These kinds of questions are kind of swirling and present in all kinds of things at the time.
Yeah. So so how does this manifest for you in the classroom when you're teaching this to your students? Like is there like initial resistance, or is it like an immediate kind of like, yeah, like I've been waiting for somebody to unlock this for me?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's a mixed bag.
Mhm.
You know, I think it really depends on the class. When I'm teaching my intro class, it's not uncommon, and I'm always pretty flattered. You know, on the first day to have some students come up and say like, "Wow, I didn't know anybody else thought about this kind of stuff. I'm so glad I'm not alone." You know, others after the class are not sold. Um, they're they're like, you know, I don't get this. It seems like an awful lot of really convoluted thinking that doesn't have a broad impact on anything I'm doing, and that's okay. I mean, not everybody's going to be really jazzed about every class they take. Um, so I think that philosophy is intrinsically valuable. I think that the study of it is really important, that it can clarify our thinking, it can clarify the way we live, it can clarify our values, or it can help us do all of these things. But, it's not for everyone, and that's all right.
Right. Yeah, again, just having done English as an undergrad, like I see like a definite kinship in the disciplines.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, in that you're having to like really interrogate things and think of things within new frameworks, right? Whereas that one's kind of more focused on literature specifically, and it sounds like philosophy is kind of opening up to pretty much everything that's part of existence. So is that overwhelming? Is that like
It certainly can be.
Mhm.
Yeah. I mean, I think thematically, English and philosophy are, are very friendly. There's a lot of overlap there, especially as you get into maybe existentialist literature.
Mhm.
You're going to have a lot of the same themes: questions about meaning, questions about uh, existence, what is value, reflections of society. Any sort of different themes you're going to get in literature are going to be things that we're going to also consider in philosophy. But the approach is obviously a little bit different. Um, Very few people sit down to read a philosophical treatise for fun, myself included. I often don't find it the most enjoyable thing to do. You kind of have to be in the right mindset. But a good novel, you can just like plow through it. Um, so is it overwhelming? Yeah, in a lot of ways it is. As I mentioned, I don't know, I've been at this for 20 some years and I still feel like I don't know much of anything about philosophy. There's so much of it, and so much to know. But it's kind of, it's overwhelming if you allow it to be. Um, but if you kind of shift your perspective on it and think about it more as an opportunity, um, I think that's the better way to look at it. So I think, like, man, there's so much I don't know, and how awful would it be if I knew all of it? If there was nothing left to learn or to think about, or sort of no new ideas to be seen or had. I think that would be really depressing. I think um, the sort of overwhelming nature of it is kind of fun. It's like, well, what do I want to think about today?
Right.
Anything, right?
Yeah.
It's all there at my fingertips.
So, do you have a particular philosopher that you find um, like personally very meaningful, or whose ideas were kind of a source of consolation when you needed them?
Uh, Geez. That's a really good question. I mean, I'm tempted to say uh, that um, Descartes is my guy.
Mhm.
Um, Not necessarily because I think he's right about things. I don't think he's right about very much. Uh, but I did my doctoral work on Descartes, and he's so interesting, and there's so many cool things going on in his work, that I just keep going back to him.
Mhm.
Um, Kind of along similar lines, lately I've been really excited by two, I think, historically understudied figures. So one is Margaret Cavendish,
Mhm.
um, and another is Mary Shepherd. Um, so Cavendish and Shepherd lived 150 years apart or so. Cavendish was married to the famous scientist, actually, William Cavendish, and she was around with the Royal Society. She was around during the English Civil War and was exiled with the Royals, and wrote all kinds of really interesting stuff. She wrote poems, she wrote philosophical treatises, she wrote novels and plays, and is just an all-around fascinating figure. Kind of a similar story, but much later. You have Mary Shepherd, who is also a royal. She was a lady of the court in England, I guess in Edinburgh, rather, in Scotland. But she sort of took it upon herself to respond to David Hume's writings, because she saw his views as being very dangerous and leading to atheism. And she wrote these two really fascinating books, sort of trying to answer the kind of Humean skepticism. And I think that, I mean, I don't want to claim that these are people who, got me through tough times or something.
Right.
But man, they're so interesting. And I really, really enjoy reading and thinking about their work.
That's fantastic. I'm trying to remember. Cavendish, was it the Blazing World? Was it?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. I'm. It's been a while, but yeah. I think that Jess Tavordi taught that in one of her.
I think so.
Courses.
Yeah. I've spoken with her a little bit about Cavendish.
Oh, right on.
Yeah. The Blazing World is a bizarre book.
Right.
And it was actually, so when she first wrote it, she actually attached it to a piece that she published, just a straightforward philosophical treatise, called Observations Upon Experimental Philosophy, where she kind of goes through and criticizes criticizes a number of natural philosophers, and then develops her own sort of vitalist picture of nature. So rather than the sort of mechanistic accounts that we got out of folks like Descartes and Galileo, where the idea is, of course, that matter is inert and it's just this kind of stuff bouncing into each other, and that's what nature is. She saw really all of nature as a sort of living organism. And so you see this playing out in the Blazing World, where she has all these bizarre sort of hybrid creatures between humans and other animals. And then they have these fights about the different disciplines that they represent. So I can't remember exactly, but I think the fly humans, the fly people, were the astronomers because they could get closer to the sky or something.
Okay, yeah.
And then they come and report to her about different views about astronomy that were sort of on the ground in the 17th century, and they're fighting it out sort of in front of her. And it's a very strange but really interesting book.
Yeah. So we have just a few minutes left. I feel like I'd be remiss if I didn't ask about kind of what's going on currently, because it is so important, and it is just very much what we're living through in the moment. And I think it's important for students, maybe if you want to give your own take on how to begin thinking through things like this, and not necessarily specifics, just anything you might want to offer in terms of how to begin to engage with that kind of like philosophical mindset, and how to think through these things, and engage with it. If that's not too big a question.
I mean, it's a massive question.
Yeah.
And I'll do my best.
Sure.
Because there's so much that's going on.
Mm-hmm.
And it's I mean, it's hard to sort through all the noise.
Right.
It's hard to sort through all the noise in every direction.
Mhm.
Uh, so whether it's COVID, and all of the kind of bizarre narratives that are surrounding that, um, or the much more tragic, well, not much more, but the equally tragic events that are occurring, um, surrounding communities of color,
Mhm.
sparked especially by the horrific video of George Floyd. Um, I mean, how do we think about it? Uh, One thing I think that we need to be really careful about, is as I said, there's a ton of information, and I think sorting through what's reliable and what isn't is both massively important, um, and also incredibly difficult. Um, in many ways, social media is an incredibly valuable tool because it allows every one of us to have access to, basically any sort of information at all ever.
Right.
um, Up to the minute events as they're occurring. We can see videos of them. We can hear commentaries. We can share information. But this is, of course, a double-edged sword, because we can also share nonsense, and we often do. Um, Something that I think that needs to be said is that, uh, not just the United States, but much of the Western world has been founded on massive racial inequality. I think that we're seeing a lot of frustration that is incredibly justified. I think that, what we're seeing playing out right now is, sadly not new, and it's sadly something that, just isn't being addressed. Um, I think that I would be remiss if I said that philosophy holds all the keys to solving all of this.
Right.
The study of philosophy itself, I think, can be helpful. It can help
Mhm.
us, as I said, sort of, um, reflect carefully about our own biases, about our own experiences. It can help us listen and understand more carefully the perspectives of others. Um, but it's also the case that there have been a large number of really influential and, I would say, sort of canonically important philosophers who advocated for horribly racist and terrible views. And so I think it's important that we remember, um, and that we highlight, um, that just because somebody is particularly intelligent or influential or powerful, it doesn't mean that they're not a flawed person who could hold horrible positions that are really problematic. And so we really need to just kind of hold everything up to particularly careful scrutiny. Um, it's really easy to say that. It's very difficult to do that. But I think this is why not just a philosophical education, but a general education overall is so critical at this point. We really need to know our history. We need to know the history of all the disciplines we're working with. Um, and we need to recognize that, uh, in basically everything that we do, there are all of these different power dynamics at play. And we need to reflect on them and think carefully about them, because the world is a complicated place, and there are systems in place that we don't think about enough. And without thinking about them, we're not going to be able to fix them.
That was really a very good answer for a math question. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you.
If students who might see this video are interested in taking a class, what intro class are you teaching and when that they might look that up?
Great. Yeah, so this fall, I'm teaching introduction, well, sorry, I think we just changed the name of it. Philosophy 1250,
Mhm.
It either is or used to be reasoning and rational decision making. I believe
Okay.
we changed it to critical thinking.
Okay.
It's a formal logic class, but I'll also put in a pitch for any philosophy class that we're offering. Phil 1000, Intro to Philosophy. I have spectacular colleagues in Professors Fitzpatrick and Ellefson. Um, Taking a class from them is outstanding, and it's definitely worth your time. Those are all offered in the fall. If you can't get them in the fall, we're going to be offering them again in the spring. And I'll also drop in a plug for an experimental class that is almost sure to be insane. Um, so Professor Roper in biology and I have put together a 6-credit gen ed class that we're offering in the spring. It'll be 3 credits of introduction to philosophy and 3 credits of gen bio. And the class is the philosophy and physiology of professional wrestling.
Wow, that is amazing. You should totally get John Belkin as a guest lecturer one day because yeah, he's into his wrestling.
Yeah, we have him on the list. We're going to have a number
Awesome.
of guest lectures, and he's definitely in there.
Fantastic.
So
Well, thank you so much. I'm going to stop our recording and then I'll just take a couple minutes to touch base with you afterwards if that's cool.
that sounds great.
Okay, thanks so much, Kris.
You bet.